When a narcissist provokes you, understand what is actually happening beneath the surface. This is not conflict in the ordinary sense, two people disagreeing, two nervous systems working toward resolution. This is engineering. The narcissist is not trying to communicate a need. He is trying to locate your nervous system's most reliable switch and press it, because your reaction is the only proof he has that he still matters to you. Provocation for him is not aggression for its own sake. It is a desperate, primitive form of connection seeking, dressed up as hostility. And here's what took the empath years to understand. Her old response, the explaining, the defending, the emotional flooding, was never weakness. It was conditioning. Somewhere earlier in her life, likely in childhood, she learned that love had to be earned through performance, that stillness in the face of someone else's distress was dangerous, even abandoning. So when the narcissist provokes her, he is not inventing a new wound. He is reaching into an old one that was carved long before he arrived. This is why the empath's refusal to perform is not coldness. It is the most sophisticated form of self-possession a human being can develop. She has learned, often through immense pain, that her nervous system does not belong to him, that his urgency is not her emergency, that she can witness his provocation the way you might witness weather moving across a landscape, present, real, even uncomfortable, without needing to control it, absorb it, or answer it on his terms. Think about what it actually means to refuse to perform. It means she has separated stimulus from response, that space Viktor Frankl wrote about, the space in which freedom lives. The narcissist is betting that this space no longer exists in her, that he still owns the reflex. And for a long time he did. But healing is precisely the recovery of that space. It is the nervous system learning, slowly, painstakingly, that it is allowed to stay regulated even when someone else is dysregulated on purpose. This is not about becoming detached from her own humanity. She still feels the provocation land. The old alarm still fires, faintly, in her chest. The difference now is that feeling it and obeying it are two separate acts. She can notice the pull toward defending herself, toward explaining, toward proving she is not what he is accusing her of being, and she can simply not go. That non-participation is not avoidance. It is the most direct confrontation with her own conditioning that she will ever have. And notice what happens to him when the loop doesn't complete. There is no performance to punish, no reaction to feed on, no chaos to point to as evidence that she is the unstable one. The provocation, unmet, has nowhere to go. It returns to its source. This is not victory in the way we usually imagine victory, loud, triumphant. It is quiet. It looks from the outside like almost nothing happened, but something enormous happened. A woman who once needed to win the argument to feel safe has learned that safety was never on the other side of his approval. It was always underneath her own 2 feet. The narcissist provokes because provocation is the only intimacy he knows how to manufacture. The empath, refusing to perform, offers him something far more honest, his own reflection unanswered in an empty room. When a narcissist withholds affection, he is not simply losing interest. Withdrawal for him is a tool, deliberate or half-conscious, it hardly matters which, designed to produce a very specific effect in you. He knows, somewhere in the architecture of his own wounding, that absence creates hunger faster than presence ever could. So he disappears. He cools. He goes quiet in the exact moment closeness was building. And he waits to see if you will run after what just left the room. For a long time, the empath did run. Not because she was foolish, but because her nervous system had been trained, early and thoroughly, to read distance as danger. If love could vanish without warning once, from a parent, a caregiver, someone whose attention was never reliable, then the body learns a lesson it doesn't forget. When affection withdraws, chase it, or lose it forever. This is not neediness. This is an old survival strategy, still firing in a body that no longer lives in that original emergency. What changes, in the empath who has done the work, is not that withdrawal stops hurting. It still registers. The chest still tightens. The old alarm still sounds somewhere beneath the ribs. What changes is what she does with that alarm. She no longer treats it as an instruction. She has learned to feel the ache of his coldness without converting that ache into action, without texting first, without softening herself into someone smaller and easier to love, without auditioning for affection that should have been freely given. This is where Gabor Maté's insight becomes essential. The question is never simply what is wrong with him. The deeper question is what happened to her. That withdrawal once felt like something she had to fix. And in asking that question honestly, she stops treating his coldness as a referendum on her worth. His silence is his regulation strategy, not her verdict. There is something almost philosophical in this stillness. To not chase is to make a claim about your own existence, that you are whole independent of his approach or retreat, that your value does not fluctuate with his temperature. Martin Buber wrote about the difference between relating to another as a whole being, a thou, versus relating to them as a means to an end, an it. When the narcissist withdraws to produce pursuit, he is treating her as an instrument of his regulation. When she declines to chase, she is refusing that role. She is insisting, silently, on being met as a person, not managed as a supply source. And this is the quiet devastation of her stillness, from his side of the equation. He is used to absence being answered. He is used to being the center of gravity, the one whose movement determines everyone else's orbit. When she doesn't chase, the strategy simply fails to produce its intended effect. And there is no more disorienting experience for someone who has always controlled the emotional weather than silence that isn't secretly begging him to come back. She isn't punishing him. She isn't performing indifference to provoke a reaction of her own. She has simply stopped believing that love requires pursuit to be real. Real love does not need to be chased. It only needs to be recognized, and what withdraws from stillness was never love to begin with. When a narcissist rewrites the past, he is not simply misremembering. This is not the ordinary fog of two people recalling an argument slightly differently. This is something more deliberate, more corrosive, a calculated erosion of your relationship to your own mind. He tells you the conversation didn't happen the way you remember it. He insists the tone was different, the words were different, that you're exaggerating, imagining, overreacting. And the goal, whether he could articulate it or not, is to make your internal compass unreliable enough that you stop consulting it and start consulting him instead. This is what gaslighting actually costs a person. Not just confusion in the moment, but something far more structural. The slow dismantling of a person's trust in her own perception. And for the empath, this cut deeper than it might for someone else, because she likely arrived into this dynamic already primed to doubt herself. Perhaps she grew up in an environment where her feelings were minimized, where being told, "That's not what happened," or "You're too sensitive," was simply the emotional weather of childhood. The narcissist did not have to teach her self-doubt from scratch. He only had to activate a lesson that was already installed. What she has since discovered, often at great cost, is that memory does not require external validation to be true. This is a radical act in a culture that constantly asks us to outsource our reality to whoever argues most confidently. She has learned to hold her internal record the way you would hold a compass in fog, not because it removes all uncertainty, but because it is the only instrument that was actually present for the terrain. Nobody else was standing where she was standing when it happened. Nobody else felt what her body felt it in that room. There's a psychological principle worth naming here. The self that can tolerate being disbelieved by others, while still trusting its own witness, has developed something rarer than confidence. It has developed what we might call internal authority, a center of gravity that does not require consensus to remain stable. This is not stubbornness. It is not refusing to ever reconsider her perspective. It is the difference between healthy openness and total self-erasure. She can stay curious about her own blind spots without surrendering her memory to someone whose only interest is control. Consider what it actually means, philosophically, to insist on your own witness. It is a declaration that your inner life is not negotiable, that your perception, however imperfect, belongs to you and cannot be legislated away by someone else's confidence or someone else's need to be right. This is not arrogance. It is the opposite of what the narcissist accuses her of being. It is the quiet, sober refusal to disappear. And here is what shifts the entire dynamic. Once she stops outsourcing reality, the narcissist loses his most effective tool. Gaslighting only functions when the target eventually capitulates, when she says, "Maybe I am remembering it wrong," and hands over the keys to her own mind. When she stops doing that, when she simply holds what she knows to be true, quietly, without needing him to agree, the distortion has nowhere left to land. She was there, she remembers, and no amount of denial from someone standing outside her experience can rewrite what her own body and mind recorded as real. When a narcissist love bombs, he is not offering you the beginning of intimacy. He is offering you a performance so intense, so precisely calibrated to your longing, that it bypasses the part of your mind that would normally ask questions. This is not romance. This is reconnaissance disguised as devotion. He studies what you've been missing: attention, certainty, being chosen. And he floods you with exactly that, not because he has come to know you deeply, but because urgency is easier to produce than intimacy, and far more effective at disabling discernment. For the empath, this used to work with devastating efficiency, not because she was naive, but because intensity has always been mistaken, in her nervous system and in the culture around her, for depth. She was taught, somewhere along the way, that love announces itself loudly, through grand gestures, through being overwhelmed, through the dizzy sensation of finally being seen. Nobody told her that a nervous system flooded with dopamine is not a nervous system capable of accurate judgment. Nobody told her that the very intensity she interpreted as proof was, in fact, the mechanism designed to override her discernment. What she understands now is something quieter and far more useful. Real connection reveals itself over time, through consistency, through what a person does when there is nothing to gain by performing. Love bombing cannot survive that test, because it was never built for duration. It was built for impact. And impact by its nature fades, which is precisely why the early chapter with a narcissist always feels like the best chapter. It was engineered to be unsustainable because its purpose was never partnership. Its purpose was capture. This is where her healing becomes almost philosophical. She has learned to hold intensity the way a scientist holds a striking result. With interest, but not yet with belief. She watches, she waits. She lets time do what emotion cannot: separate what is real from what is merely convincing. This is not cynicism. It is not a hardened heart refusing to feel joy at being pursued. It is discernment, the capacity to feel something fully while still asking whether it is trustworthy. There is a developmental truth beneath all of this. Children who grow up in unpredictable environments often learn to equate chaos with aliveness, and calm with boredom or even danger. If love, in childhood, arrived unpredictably, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes absent, then a nervous system can grow up associating emotional volatility with the presence of love itself. Healing, then, is not just about spotting manipulation. It is about relearning what safety actually feels like, even when safety feels at first unfamiliar and quiet. So when the empath watches instead of melts, she is not rejecting passion. She is refusing to let a stranger's performance stand in for a partner's proven character. She has learned that anyone can say the right words in the first month. Only time reveals who continues showing up once the audience is gone. The narcissist needs her swept away quickly, before her judgment catches up to his script. Her stillness, her willingness to simply observe rather than immediately merge, denies him the one thing his entire strategy depends on: speed. What arrives instantly rarely stays. What stays was never in a hurry to convince you of anything at all. When a narcissist punishes with silence, he is using one of the oldest tools of control there is. Not the sword, but the absence of the sword. Silence, in his hands, is not peace. It is a weapon calibrated to produce a very specific kind of suffering. The suffering of not knowing. Not knowing what you did wrong. Not knowing when it will end. Not knowing whether you are still loved at all. He understands, intuitively or otherwise, that uncertainty is more destabilizing than conflict. An argument gives you something to respond to. Silence gives you nothing. Only your own mind, left alone to fill the void with fear. For the empath, that void used to feel unbearable. She would fill it with apology, with self-interrogation, with a frantic search for whatever offense might explain his withdrawal, even when there was no offense to find. This is because silence, for a nervous system shaped by early inconsistency, does not register as neutral. It registers as threat. If a caregiver's withdrawal once meant real danger, real abandonment, real loss of safety, then the body never fully unlearns that silence equals emergency, unless it is deliberately, patiently retrained. This is the retraining she has undergone. Somewhere along her healing, she stopped treating his silence as a problem to solve, and started treating it as information. Information about him, not a referendum on her. And in that shift, something remarkable happened. The space he intended as punishment became, instead, a room she could finally hear herself in. Without his voice managing her attention, without his moods dictating her schedule, she had, perhaps for the first time in the relationship, uninterrupted access to her own thoughts. Gabor Maté often speaks of the body keeping score of what the mind is too overwhelmed to process in real time. The silent treatment, ironically, gave the empath what the relationship itself never offered: stillness long enough to actually feel what she'd been suppressing. She used that silence to grieve, to reflect, to notice patterns she'd been too flooded to see while she was busy managing his temperature. The very tool meant to starve her into re-engaging became, instead, the incubation chamber for her exit. There is something almost poetic in this reversal. He withholds his voice to make her smaller, more anxious, more desperate for his return, and she uses that same withheld voice to grow larger, clearer, more her own. The silence he intended as a cage becomes, in her hands, a door. This is not about romanticizing abandonment or suggesting that silence doesn't hurt. It does. But pain and defeat are not the same thing. She can feel the sting of his withdrawal and still choose what she does with the space it creates. That choice, to turn inward rather than outward, to use the quiet for healing rather than pursuit, is not a small adjustment. It is the entire architecture of her transformation compressed into a single decision made over and over every time he goes quiet. He thinks silence starves her. What he doesn't understand is that some things only grow in the dark. Roots, patience, and a woman finally left alone long enough to hear her own voice again. When a narcissist plays the victim, he is reaching for the oldest disguise available to anyone who has ever needed to avoid accountability: innocence. Suddenly he is the one who was misunderstood, mistreated, hurt by circumstances beyond his control. Suddenly the conversation that was supposed to address his behavior becomes a conversation about his pain. This is not coincidence. This is strategy, even when it isn't fully conscious. Because nothing disarms an empathic person faster than the appearance of someone suffering. The empath has always been wired to respond to pain. This is not a flaw. It is, in most contexts, one of the most valuable capacities a human being can have. But in this particular dynamic, that capacity became a liability, because the narcissist learned, quickly, instinctively, that her compassion could be summoned on command. All he had to do was perform vulnerability, and her instinct to comfort would override whatever legitimate grievance she had been holding seconds before. This is where the work of healing becomes almost surgical. It is not about becoming less compassionate. It is about learning to distinguish between someone who is actually struggling and someone who is using the appearance of struggle as an exit from accountability. These can look identical on the surface, the same trembling voice, the same claim of being overwhelmed, but they diverge completely in what follows. Genuine vulnerability opens toward change. Performed vulnerability closes the subject and redirects the focus. Fritz Perls once described a hallmark of manipulation as demanding from the environment what one should be supplying for oneself. This is precisely what victim playing asks of the empath, that she supply the accountability, the resolution, the healing that the narcissist refuses to generate internally. And for years, she did supply it. She absorbed his unprocessed pain and metabolized it into forgiveness on his behalf, without him ever having to do the work himself. What changes is not that she stops feeling compassion. She still feels it. That is not a switch that healing turns off. What changes is that she no longer lets compassion function as an automatic override of her own boundaries. She can hold two things simultaneously. I see that you are in pain, and I am still not responsible for fixing it, especially not at the cost of my own reality being erased. This dual awareness, empathy without self-abandonment, is one of the most difficult psychological achievements a caretaking person can reach, and one of the most necessary. There is something quietly devastating from his side about compassion that no longer converts into rescue. He is used to his vulnerability functioning as a trapdoor out of consequences. When she stays warm but still holds the boundary, when she says, in effect, I care about your pain, and this conversation is still about what you did, the trapdoor simply stops working. The performance runs, and nothing opens beneath her. She has not become hard. She has become discerning. And discernment, in a woman who was once endlessly available for rescue, is not the absence of love. It is love, finally, with its foundation intact. When a narcissist devalues her growth, understand what is actually being threatened. It is not her behavior that troubles him. It is her becoming. Every time she sets a boundary she wouldn't have set a year ago, every time she recognizes a pattern she used to be blind to, every time she chooses herself without apologizing for it, something in him registers this as danger, because her growth is quite literally the erosion of his control. A person who is healing is a person who is becoming harder to manipulate. He can feel that shift even when he cannot name it, and so he attacks the growth itself, disguising the attack as concern, as criticism, as claims that she has changed for the worse. This is one of the cruelest ironies of the entire dynamic. The more she heals, the more she is punished for healing. The narcissist will tell her she used to be softer, warmer, easier, as though her old compliance was a virtue, and her new clarity is a defect. And here is where the empath's discernment must reach its sharpest point, because this kind of criticism is engineered to sound like wisdom. It borrows the language of concern to disguise an agenda of control. What she has learned, and this did not come easily, is that devaluation aimed at growth is not information about her character. It is a symptom of what her growth threatens in him. This reframe changes everything. Instead of internalizing the criticism and shrinking back toward the version of herself he preferred, she begins to read the criticism itself as confirmation. If her growth is provoking this much resistance, it is because the growth is real, and it is working. There is a developmental principle worth naming here, one that echoes across nearly every framework of psychological maturation. Growth is rarely celebrated by those who benefited from your smallness. This is not cynicism. It is simply the honest architecture of change. The people most invested in who you used to be are often the last people who will affirm who you are becoming. Not because they are villains, but because your evolution requires them to either grow alongside you or lose the version of the relationship that served them. The empath, understanding this, stops waiting for his approval as a precondition for her continued growth. This is a profound act of psychological independence. She no longer needs him to validate her boundaries in order to trust that the boundaries are healthy. She no longer needs his comfort with her transformation in order to believe the transformation is good. She has, in effect, become her own witness, the very capacity we spoke of earlier, now applied not just to memory, but to her own unfolding self. And so his devaluation, instead of pulling her backward, becomes almost a form of confirmation. Each time he criticizes the woman she is becoming, she hears underneath the words, an admission. The old version of her was easier to control. She does not need him to say it outright. The resistance itself is the evidence. She does not shrink to make his discomfort disappear. She has learned that her growth was never his to approve. It was always only hers to claim. When a narcissist finally realizes she's gone, something shifts in him that he did not see coming. The apologies arrive. The insight arrives, or at least its imitation. The promises arrive, the ones that were always just out of reach while she was still available, still hoping, still willing to wait for the version of him that never quite showed up. And now, only now, when the supply is genuinely gone, does he find the words he could never find before. This is not transformation. This is loss doing what presence never could, forcing a confrontation with consequence. For the first time, there is no more waiting on the other end, no audience left to perform insight for. And so what looks from the outside like sudden clarity is often something far more self-serving, an attempt to reopen a door before it seals permanently shut. The old version of the empath would have felt the pull of this moment intensely, not because she was weak, but because this was precisely what she had been waiting for during every silence, every devaluation, every unmet apology throughout the relationship. This, the acknowledgement, the remorse, the finally, was the fantasy that kept her holding on far longer than she should have. So when it finally arrives, it arrives aimed directly at the oldest wound in the entire dynamic, her hope that he was capable of this all along. But here is what she has learned. In the space she built without him, closure was never something he could give her. She used to believe she needed his understanding in order to fully leave. That without his acknowledgement, the relationship would remain unfinished, an open loop demanding resolution. What she discovered instead is that closure is not a gift bestowed by the person who caused the wound. It is a conclusion reached internally, built slowly, through the very growth he spent so long trying to prevent. This is perhaps the deepest philosophical turn in her entire journey. She has stopped needing the story to end the way she once imagined, with him finally seeing her, finally choosing her, finally becoming who she needed him to be. She has written her own ending instead, one that does not require his participation to be complete. Viktor Frankl wrote that everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. She has exercised that freedom fully. She has chosen not to reopen a story that already, quietly, reached its conclusion inside her. So when his realization finally comes, sincere or strategic, it hardly matters anymore. She does not answer it with the old urgency. She feels it, she acknowledges it, perhaps even with some compassion for what he is only now capable of understanding. And then she continues walking because the woman who needed him to say these words no longer exists. She rebuilt herself in his absence, and that rebuilding did not leave room for a version of the story that starts over. He is arriving at a door that closed itself long ago, expecting to find the woman who once stood there waiting. She is no longer standing there. She never has to again.